You want to hear a story about the absolute peak of satisfaction, the kind of moment that only comes once in a lifetime if you're lucky enough to have the right tools and the wrong enemies? I'm pretty sure I hold the unofficial world record for rectifying the most HOA violations in a single afternoon. We're talking about 139 of them just vanishing into the murky depths without me ever having to raise my voice or lift more than a single finger. But before I get into how I used basic physics to dismantle a multi-million-dollar ego trip, do me a favor and drop a comment below letting me know where you're tuning in from, because this story is about legacy, dirt under the fingernails, and why you should never, ever try to out-engineer a man whose family has owned the water for a century. My name is Elias Vance, and I live in a place called Blackwood Basin, tucked away in a corner of the Appalachians where the cell service is spotty, but the history is thick, and for 5 generations, the Vances have been the quiet keepers of a 700-acre body of water we call Vance's Reach. My great-great-grandfather, Silas Vance, wasn't a rich man, but he was a visionary with a degree in civil engineering and a stubborn streak a mile wide, and back in the late 1920s, he bought up a rocky, and quote, useless, and quote, gorge where 4 mountain creeks converged, and with a crew of local stonemasons and more dynamite than was probably legal at the time, he built a dam. It wasn't a government project or a utility company behemoth. It was a private masterpiece of cyclopean masonry, carved from the very rock it sat upon, creating a private lake that was meant for flood control, fire suppression, and the kind of solitude you can't buy anymore. And that stone lodge he built on the high promontory overlooking the water, that's my kitchen window view every single morning. For decades, we lived in a state of mutual respect with the mountains. We paid our taxes, we maintained the spillways and the deeds to the land, the lake bed, and most importantly, the riparian rights remained ironclad within the Vance family trust. And then, the end quote, New World end quote, arrived in the form of a developer named Sterling Peaks who bought a 1,000-acre timber tract right against my eastern border and decided the world needed another gated community for people who want to live in the woods without actually being in the woods. They called it the sanctuary at Sterling Peaks, and for the first year I didn't in oppos. Mind much. I stayed on my hill, they stayed in their cul-de-sacs, and I figure as long as they didn't in oppos. Dumped their grass clippings in my water, we were fine. But then I met Victoria Sterling Vane, the inaugural HOA president, and a woman who possessed the unique, terrifying ability to look at a century of history and see nothing but an unmonetized asset. Victoria was the kind of person who wore designer hiking boots that had never touched actual mud and drove a Range Rover just to go to the mailbox. And the first time she climbed my driveway to, end quote, introduce, end quote, herself, she didn't in oppos. Lead with a pie or a hello. She led with a clipboard and a frown, telling me that my private dock, the one Silas built with hand-hewn cedar in 1932, was, end quote, not in compliance with the community's aesthetic guidelines, end quote, and that I'd need to paint it, end quote, pelican gray, end quote, by the end of the month. I remember leaning against my porch railing, looking at her with a mix of confusion and genuine amusement, and I told her, as politely as a man can, that unless her HOA had managed to annex the laws of private property while I was taking a nap, her authority ended exactly where the asphalt of her gated road met the dirt of my driveway. She didn't end oppos. Like that, not one bit. And as she walked away, her heels clicking on the stones, I saw that look in her eyes, the look of a person who ISN and oppos, used to being told, end quote, no, end quote, by a man in a flannel shirt. The passive-aggressive emails started shortly after, followed by community newsletters that conveniently refer to Vance's Reach as, end quote, the sanctuary community lake, end quote. But the real war started when Victoria decided that her kingdom needed a, end quote, waterfront village, end quote, to boost property values. And since my shoreline was the only flat, beautiful part of the basin, she simply decided it was hers. I woke up one morning to find a crew of surveyors on my lower flats, and when I went down there to ask what the hell they were doing, they showed me a map, a brand new county stamp plat map that showed the HOA boundary, end quote, jogging, end quote, out 300 yards into my territory, effectively absorbing 50 acres of my prime shoreline and the very cove where Silas had first broken ground. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fraud, signed off by a surveyor who I later found out had been, end quote, consulting, for the developer for years, and it was the first time in my life I felt a cold, sharp anger that went all the way to my bones. I tried the civilized route first. I really did. I hired a lawyer named Miller, a man who'd been practicing in these mountains since the Nixon administration, and we sent a cease and desist that was as clear as the mountain air, including copies of my original 1929 deed and my own recent high-precision GPS survey. Victoria's response? She held a town hall meeting, which I attended from the back row, where she stood on a stage and called me a, disgruntled squatter, who was trying to hold the community's progress hostage, and she actually had the audacity to wave my lawyer and Oppo's letter in the air and tell 200 homeowners that, the lake is the heart of our community, and we will not let one man's greed stop us from enjoying what is rightfully ours, The applause was deafening, fueled by people who had bought into a dream and didn't Oppo's care whose reality they had to trample to get it. And that was the moment I realized that Victoria was an Oppo's playing by the rules of law. She was playing the game of, possession is 9/10, betting that by the time I could get a judge to look at the paperwork, the damage would be done. The bulldozers arrived that Monday, and it felt like a physical blow to the chest watching them tear through the old-growth oaks Silas had planted, leveling the ground for what Victoria called, the 139, a collection of luxury, prefab, eco cabins, for short-term vacation rentals that would sit right at the water's edge. I called the sheriff, a guy I'd gone to high school with, and he came out, looked at my deed, looked at her, new, map, and just shook his head, telling me, Elias, I'm a peace officer, not a surveyor. This is a civil boundary dispute, and until a court tells me otherwise, I can't Oppo's stop a crew with a permit from the county, Victoria was standing there in a hard hat that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust, smiling that brittle, porcelain smile of hers, and she leaned in and whispered, The world is changing, Mr. Vance. You can either drown in the past or sell us the rest of the lake for a fair price. But either way, those cabins are going up, I didn't Oppo's. I didn't Oppo's. Threatened. I just went back up to my lodge, sat in my great-grandfather's leather armchair, and started to think. I'm an engineer, and in engineering, every problem has a structural weakness, and Victoria's weakness was her absolute, blinding arrogance and her complete lack of understanding regarding how a dam actually works. She saw the lake as a static blue shape on a map, a decorative pond that stayed exactly where she wanted it to be, but I knew better. I knew that Vance's Reach was a living, breathing system of pressure and flow, and as I dug through Silas's old engineering log from 1928, I found the, smoking gun, I've forgotten was even there. You see, when Silas built the dam, he was worried about the, 100-year floods, that occasionally ripped through these mountains, so he engineered the spillways to maintain a recreational level of 1,210 feet above sea level. But the dam itself? The actual structural crest of that masonry wall was built to safely hold a maximum pool of 1,218 feet. 8 feet. It doesn't Oppo's sound like much when you're standing on a mountain, but when you're talking about 700 acres of water, 8 vertical feet is a monumental volume of liquid. And more importantly, my 1929 deed didn't Oppo's just give me the land under the water. It gave me the, perpetual and exclusive right to manage, fluctuate, and control the water levels of Vance's Reach for the purposes of maintenance, safety, and dam integrity up to the maximum engineer capacity of the structure, I grabbed my topographical maps and my surveying rover and spent the next 3 nights in the dark, marking out the 1,218-foot contour line, and what I found made me laugh out loud in the middle of silent forest. Victoria, in her rush to pack 139 cabins onto, her, new shoreline, had built every single one of them between the 1,211 and 1,217 foot marks. She had built a multi-million-dollar village inside my flood easement, literally inside the bowl of my lake, and she was so convinced she'd stolen the land that she never stopped to ask who owned the volume of the air above it. For the next 2 months, I watched like a ghost from my porch as the, village, sprouted like a fungus, these high-end glass and timber cabins with heated floors and designer decks, all of them built on concrete slabs just inches above the current water line. Victoria was out there every day in a golf cart, directing the landscapers to put in quote, manicured beach sand, and expensive ornamental shrubs, and every time she saw me watching through binoculars, she'd wave with a look of smug victory, thinking she'd won the war of attrition because my lawyer was still buried in quote, motions to delay, from her corporate legal team, but I wasn't in oppos. Waiting for a judge anymore. I was waiting for the spring rains, and I was spending my nights. In the end, gallery, the narrow concrete tunnel that runs through the heart of the dam, greasing the massive 48-inch cast-iron sluice gates that hadn't end oppos, been fully closed in 30 years. The timing had to be perfect, and as a massive weather system started rolling in from the west, the kind of slow, heavy rain that turns mountain creeks into roaring torrents, I sent one final formal letter to the HOA board in Victoria, hand-delivered by a process server this time. It was notice of emergency maintenance and flood mitigation, stating that due to the incoming weather and the need to inspect the lower masonry seals, I would be exercising my deeded right to raise the lake to its maximum engineered capacity of 1,218 feet starting at 8 a.m. on Friday. And the letter explicitly warned that any unauthorized structures or property located below the 1,218-foot contour line, were within the active flood easement and should be evacuated immediately to prevent loss of life or property. I knew exactly what she'd do, and sure enough, Miller called me an hour later saying their lawyers had laughed at him, calling it a transparent intimidation tactic, and telling us that if I tampered with the lake levels to harass their residents, they'd have me in a cell by Monday. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum and a steady, rhythmic rain that felt like the mountains were taking a deep breath, and at exactly 8 a.m., I walked down into the cool, damp silence of the dam gallery with a thermos of coffee and a heavy iron wrench. The two main sluice gates are operated by hand-cranked gears, a system designed to be slow and deliberate, so you don in oppos. Shock the ecosystem downstream. And as I put my weight in the first turn, I felt the groan of 80-year-old metal resisting, then yielding, and then the deep, vibrating hum of the water pressure shifting began to echo through the stone. I turned, and I turned, and I turned, until the gates were narrowed to a mere fraction of their normal flow, and then I went to the second gate and did the same, and outside, deep under the surface, the exit, for Vance's reach was being choked off while the four mountain creeks were dumping thousands of gallons a second into the basin. I spent the next 6 hours in my lodge, watching through a spotting scope, and the transition was almost beautiful in its inevitability. At first, the water just looked full, lapping at the very edge of Victoria's expensive new sand, and I saw a few construction workers stop and point, probably thinking it was just a high tide from the rain. But the rain didn't end oppos. Stop, and the creeks kept roaring, and by noon, the beach was gone, and the water was beginning to swirl around the legs of the designer lounge chairs Victoria had set out for the grand opening. By 2 p.m., the first row of cabins, the most expensive ones with the uninterrupted views, were no longer on the shore. They were in the lake, the water creeping up over the door thresholds and through the floor vents, and that's when the panic started. I watched through the scope as Victoria's white Range Rover came flying down the gated road, splashing through deep puddles, and she jumped out into 6 inches of water, her mouth hanging open as she looked at her village, turning into a swamp. She was screaming at her foreman, gesturing wildly at the lake as if she could command the water to go back. And then she saw me. I was standing on my porch, 300 feet above her, holding a cup of coffee, and even from that distance, I could feel the heat of her rage. She actually tried to drive her Rover on my service road to confront me, but the mud was too thick, and she ended up stuck halfway, shouting into the rain about how she was going to, ruin, me, how this was, illegal, how I was, destroying her life's work, It's not destruction, Victoria, I shouted back, my voice carrying easily over the roar of the rain. End quote. It's just maintenance. I sent you the notice. You're standing in my flood easement. I'd suggest you move your car before the 1,215 mark hits. End quote. By nightfall, the lake had reached 1,217 feet, and the scene was straight out of a disaster movie. 139 luxury cabins were flooded to the windowsills, their electrical systems shorting out in a series of blue sparks that lit up the rainy night, and the expensive prefab timber was soaking up that lake water like a sponge, warping and groaning under the pressure. The HOA board called the sheriff, the fire department, and eventually the state police, and they all gathered at the end of my driveway. But when they saw the certified mail receipts, the engineering log from 1928, and the ironclad deed that Silas had signed a century ago, the state trooper just looked at Victoria and said, and quote, "Mon oppos, he gave you legal notice that he was raising the water on his own property to the level the dam was built for. Why did you build a city in a lake bed?" And, quote, "The fallout was a slow-motion car wreck that took 2 years to fully resolve. The insurance companies took one look at the fraudulent survey and the fact that the construction occurred within a documented, deeded flood easement, and they didn't into oppos. T just denied the claims. They practically laughed the developers out of the office, labeling the whole project, in quote, gross negligence, in quote. The homeowners, the people who had sunk their life savings into, in quote, the sanctuary, in quote, realized they'd been sold a bill of goods by a woman who didn't into oppos. T understand the land she was colonizing, and the class action lawsuits started flying like confetti, targeting Victoria, the developer, and the HOA board personally. Victoria's, in quote, kingdom, in quote, crumbled in months. She was voted out in a meeting that reportedly turned into a shouting match, and she disappeared from Blackwood Basin shortly after a Range Rover was repossessed, leaving behind a, in quote, village, in quote, of rotting, mold-infested timber and warped glass. I kept the lake at 1,218 feet for 30 days. I want to make sure the water did its job, that it soaked into every pore of those illegal structures until they were beyond saving, and when I finally opened the sluice gates and let the water return to its normal level, what was left was a graveyard of hubris, a 50-acre stretch of mud and ruins. Because the HOA and the developer were tied up in bankruptcy court, nobody had the money to, in quote, clean up, in quote, the mess, so I filed a suit for, in quote, environmental trespass and hazardous debris abandonment, end quote. And since I was the only one with the resources to remediate the land, the court eventually granted me the title to the entire 50-acre strip as part of a settlement. I didn't in oppos. T rebuild the cabins. I didn't in oppos. T sell the lots. I hired a crew to tear down the ruins, sell the scrap metal to cover the costs. And then I spent the next year planting 3,000 native willow and oak saplings. Today, if you paddle a kayak into that cove, you won in oppos. T see any glass or, in quote, pelican gray, in quote, paint, you'll see a thriving wetland where the herons hunt and the water is quiet again, and a new board of the reorganized HOA. Mostly regular folks who just want a quiet life. Never sends me newsletters anymore. They just wave when they see me on the dam because they know the history now. They know that the Van Cest Don and oppos. T just live by the lake. We are the lake. So, I've got to ask you, if someone stole your family's legacy right in front of your face and the law was too slow to help, would you have the patience to let nature handle the heavy lifting, or is there a point where, in quote, playing by the rules, in quote, just becomes an invitation for people like Victoria to walk all over you? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where the line is between, in quote, protecting your own, in quote, and, in quote, going too far, in quote. So let's talk about it in the comments. And if you ever find yourself in the mountains of Appalachia, just remember one thing. Always check the high water mark before you start pouring concrete. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.